The chamber was heavy with silence, that particular silence only found in rooms where power itself seems to vibrate in the air. Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat poised behind the polished bench, her expression sharp, her eyes fixed with the cool detachment of someone convinced she already knew how this moment would unfold. Then, without hesitation, she delivered the line. It was dismissive, clipped, and cutting, less an argument than a brush of the hand, as if Jasmine Crockett's presence, her perspective, her very standing, could be waved away like an inconvenience. The words landed like a slap, reverberating off marble walls. For a split second, it seemed as though time slowed. Reporters stopped scribbling. Cameras tightened their focus. The gallery shifted in uneasy whispers, an audible ripple moving like a current through the crowd. Barrett's remark wasn't just a jab, it was a message. A message that authority would not be challenged. That old hierarchies would remain unbroken. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed just enough to signal the weight of what had been said, but her posture remained steady, her hands folded in calm defiance. Where others might have recoiled, Crockett leaned into the silence. It was the silence before a storm, the kind of silence that makes an entire room hold its breath. Barrett's supporters exchanged satisfied glances, convinced that the verbal blow had landed cleanly. Yet even they couldn't ignore the shift in atmosphere. Something about Crockett's stillness suggested not defeat but preparation. She was waiting, measuring, letting the arrogance of the moment sink into the public record before she spoke. And then, in the murmurs, in the half-smiles of those who believed the exchange was already over, came the hook. What she said next stunned the room, but no one expected Jasmine Crockett's response. The cameras lingered on Crockett's face, searching for a crack, a twitch, any sign of unraveling. They found none. Instead, the room, tense, alive, almost vibrating with anticipation, braced itself for the counterstrike. Because if Barrett had intended to silence, she had unknowingly set the stage for something far greater. To the casual observer, it might have looked like just another tense moment in Washington, a judge known for her conservative convictions sparring with a congresswoman who carried herself with fire. But beneath the surface, this was not simply a clash of personalities. It was something deeper, rawer, charged with all the electricity of America's cultural divide. Amy Coney Barrett embodied a vision of power rooted in tradition, a world where authority was cloaked in robes, where elite institutions held the keys to legitimacy, where questions of justice were filtered through narrow corridors of privilege. She sat as the very image of establishment order, confident that her position, her education, her connections, made her untouchable. Jasmine Crockett represented something else entirely. A daughter of grit, unapologetically outspoken, visibly unafraid to carry her identity into spaces where it had long been dismissed. To her supporters, she wasn't just a politician, she was a mirror. A mirror for every young woman who had been underestimated, for every immigrant family who had been told to wait their turn, for every community that had been told their voices were too loud, too brash, too inconvenient. Crockett wasn't just responding for herself, she was standing in for millions. That is what made Barrett's remark cut so deeply. It wasn't just a swipe at a congresswoman. It was an attempt to delegitimize an entire presence in that room, the presence of black women in power, the presence of those who refused to temper their truths to fit into pre-written scripts. And in that instant, the stakes of the confrontation shot far beyond the marble walls. For progressives watching at home, for activists scrolling through live-stream clips, for young people glued to their phones, this was a line in the sand. Barrett's tone symbolized the old guard trying to put a lid on the new. Crockett's impending response carried the hope of everyone who was tired of waiting for permission to exist fully in the American story. It wasn't just legal theory. It wasn't just politics. It was identity colliding with power, generational confidence clashing with entrenched authority. And though only a handful of words had been spoken, the anticipation in the air suggested what came next would not remain confined to this chamber. It would explode outward, into headlines, into hashtags, into the national conversation. Already, phones in the gallery were buzzing. Reporters were firing off first impressions to editors. Clips were being cut mid-hearing, ready to be blasted across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. The chamber had become a stage, and the world was already watching. All it would take was one moment, one sharp, unforgettable retort, to transform a tense exchange into a cultural flashpoint. And that was the weight Crockett now carried. She wasn't just defending herself against Barrett's arrogance. She was defending every voice that had ever been told to shrink, to stay quiet, to know its place. The room seemed to lean forward in unison, bracing for what was about to unfold. Before the remark that silenced the chamber and set the internet ablaze, Amy Coney Barrett had already built a reputation, one polished by institutions, praised by conservatives, but also shadowed by controversy. To her allies, she was the embodiment of judicial restraint, a poised woman who carried herself with the serenity of a marble statue. But beneath that facade lay a pattern, an arrogance sharpened by privilege, an elitism that often translated into dismissiveness toward those who challenged her worldview. She rose swiftly through the ranks, propelled by the very networks that have long defined America's ruling class. A product of elite schools, surrounded by the safe applause of those who already agreed with her, Barrett rarely had to confront what it meant to be questioned, much less by someone who represented communities long pushed to the margins. And when she finally stepped onto the national stage during her Supreme Court confirmation, the contradictions began to show. There was the insistence that she would interpret the Constitution without bias, yet her decisions often leaned in favor of the powerful over the vulnerable. There were the carefully measured words during her hearings, yet her body language betrayed disdain for those senators who dared push too hard, especially women and progressives. She maintained the mask of composure, but time and again her answers carried the chill of someone convinced that their vision of the law was above reproach. Her critics noticed the pattern. When confronted on reproductive rights, Barrett sidestepped, cloaking certainty in vagueness. When asked about systemic inequities, she defaulted to abstractions, as if lived struggles were mere hypotheticals. And each time, she wielded her calm tone like armor, a way to dismiss without appearing flustered, to silence without raising her voice. It was a calculated strategy, one that worked in rooms where challengers were expected to yield. But arrogance has a way of leaving fingerprints. Reporters who followed her career spoke of a subtle disdain for dissenters, a quiet but unmistakable certainty that she was always the adult in the room. Those who disagreed weren't treated as equals but as students to be corrected, nuisances to be managed. That tone of lofty superiority became a hallmark, one that critics labeled not judicial restraint but judicial condescension. And now, in the clash with Jasmine Crockett, those fingerprints were everywhere. Barrett's dismissive remark was not a slip of the tongue, it was the latest entry in a long record. It carried the same chill as her responses to senators during her confirmation, the same frost she projected in dissent against more inclusive interpretations of law. The same contradictions appeared again, the judge who prided herself on composure now revealed her hand. The subtle disdain was no longer subtle. It was cutting, it was visible, and it was personal. Cameras captured her expression in high definition. The slight smirk. The deliberate pause. The unspoken message, I am untouchable, and you are not on my level. For those who had watched her career, it was familiar. For those in the chamber, it was infuriating. For Jasmine Crockett, it was an open invitation. Barrett had spent her career dismissing challengers, confident in the insulation of her title, her robe, her position in the hierarchy of power. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't facing a deferential senator or a panel of colleagues steeped in the same traditions. She was facing someone who did not accept the premise that authority was absolute. Someone who had built her career on breaking down barriers, not bowing to them. But standing across from Barrett was someone she never anticipated. Long before she ever stood in that chamber, facing the icy glare of Amy Coney Barrett, Jasmine Crockett was fighting battles that shaped her into the woman who could hold her ground when it mattered most. Her story did not begin with privilege or prestige. It began with grit, with the stubborn belief that a voice sharpened by truth could cut through even the thickest walls of power. Born and raised in a working-class family, Crockett learned early that silence was not survival, it was surrender. She saw injustice not in law books but in neighborhoods, not as theory but as lived reality. She carried those lessons with her into law school, refusing to smooth out her edges to fit into a mold that was never designed for her. Where others might have dulled their fire to seem respectable, Crockett leaned into hers. It was her power, her compass, her way of ensuring she never forgot where she came from. When she entered the legal profession, Crockett chose the hard cases, the ones too messy for those chasing prestige. She defended those who couldn't afford to stand alone, showing up in courtrooms that often expected her to be quiet, deferential, grateful just to be present. But Crockett never played that role. She challenged prosecutors, exposed contradictions, demanded fairness. She knew the risks: being dismissed, being labeled too aggressive, being sidelined. But to her, those labels were proof she was doing her job. Her move into politics was not born out of ambition but necessity. She had seen firsthand how laws written in distant halls crushed lives at the street level. If she wanted change, she couldn't just argue inside courtrooms, she had to rewrite the rules themselves. In the Texas House of Representatives, she quickly developed a reputation as a firebrand, fearless at the microphone, unrelenting in committee rooms, unafraid to call out hypocrisy even when it came from powerful men who expected her silence. That reputation followed her to Congress, where she brought the same sharpness, the same refusal to play small. On Capitol Hill, her voice cut through the monotony of political theater. She spoke with the cadence of someone raised not to impress elites but to be understood by neighbors, by mothers, by working families who didn't have time for jargon. Her charisma wasn't polished by consultants, it was raw, authentic, magnetic. It was the charisma of someone who had lived the struggle she spoke about, and that was why she became such a lightning rod. To progressives, Crockett was the kind of representative who reminded them politics could still have teeth. To conservatives, she was a threat precisely because she could not be easily boxed in. She wasn't afraid to call out double standards. She wasn't afraid to turn her opponents' words against them. And perhaps most dangerously for the establishment, she was good at it. Too good. Her plain-spoken sharpness became her trademark. She could distill a policy fight into a one-liner that spread across social media within hours. She could deliver a clapback that left her opponents visibly rattled, replayed endlessly in clips that her supporters shared like trophies. Every time, she reminded audiences that she wasn't just performing, she was channeling their frustration, their pride, their hunger for dignity. And yet, for all the headlines, there was a core to Crockett that remained steady: service. Beneath the firebrand persona was the same woman who had walked into courtrooms for clients who couldn't pay, the same woman who believed politics was worthless unless it was rooted in lifting up those left out of the American promise. She was not flawless, no fighter is, but her imperfections made her real. Her strength was not in pretending she was above the fray but in diving into it, emerging sharper, louder, and still standing. That was the Jasmine Crockett who now sat in that chamber, facing Barrett's dismissive remark. Years of being underestimated had prepared her for this. Years of being told she was too much had taught her how to wield her presence as a weapon. And years of defending others had taught her that when you fight back, you don't just fight for yourself, you fight for everyone watching. The room may have seen a judge with robes and authority versus a congresswoman with sharp words. But in truth, the balance of power was far more complex. Crockett carried the weight of every community told they didn't belong in rooms like this. Barrett carried the arrogance of a system that believed it could never be challenged. And when the moment came, Crockett didn't just speak, she commanded. The moment the words left Barrett's lips, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted from stiff to suffocating. Her tone was clipped, deliberate, as though every syllable carried the weight of final judgment. She spoke with the same icy detachment that had earned her a reputation for authority, her voice slicing through the room like glass against stone. To Barrett, this wasn't just an exchange, it was an assertion. A reminder of who held the gavel, of who was meant to command obedience. Jasmine Crockett didn't so much as blink. Her eyes remained steady, her expression calm, her body language controlled. It was composure not born of indifference, but of discipline. She had heard voices like Barrett's her entire life, voices that tried to diminish, voices that declared who was worthy and who was not. Instead of breaking her, they had shaped her. And in this moment, Crockett transformed Barrett's cold remarks into fuel, steadying herself for what was coming next. The chamber itself seemed to recognize the collision unfolding. A cough echoed from the back row, sharp against the silence. Cameras zoomed closer, desperate to capture every twitch of the face, every shift in posture. A low gasp rippled across the gallery when Barrett pressed harder, delivering another veiled dismissal as if Crockett's presence were an inconvenience more than a challenge. Crockett didn't respond, not yet. She let the remarks hang in the air, let the weight of Barrett's arrogance accumulate. Her stillness began to unnerve even Barrett's allies, who shifted in their seats, uncertain whether the silence meant defeat or calculation. Every second Crockett remained quiet became its own form of resistance, an unspoken declaration that she was not rattled, not cornered, not diminished. Barrett leaned forward slightly, a smirk curling at the edge of her lips, mistaking Crockett's composure for concession. She continued, her voice sharpening, as though determined to push Crockett into a reaction. But instead of recoiling, Crockett drew strength from the escalation. Her jaw tightened, her eyes burned with a quiet intensity, her posture never faltering. Reporters glanced at one another, scribbling furiously. They could feel the tension coiling, a spring wound tighter with each exchange. Even the gallery, often subdued by protocol, was restless, shifting feet, raised eyebrows, whispered exchanges. The longer Barrett pressed, the clearer it became that something was building, something that could not be contained within the walls of this chamber. The clash was no longer just about words. It was about presence, about who could command the room without even speaking. Barrett relied on her robe, her authority, her title. Crockett relied on nothing but herself, her poise, her history, her conviction. And with each passing second, the balance began to tilt. Those who came expecting Barrett to dominate now sensed a miscalculation. The judge's dismissiveness, once a shield, was starting to sound brittle, defensive. Crockett's silence, once perceived as restraint, now read as power. It was the kind of silence that announced a storm was coming. The cameras tightened their grip on Crockett's face. The gallery leaned forward as one, breaths caught in collective anticipation. Even Barrett paused, momentarily unsettled by the fact that her strikes had not landed the way she intended. And then, in the middle of the tension, Crockett shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle lean forward, the kind of movement that electrifies a room because everyone knows what it means. The silence deepened. The gallery froze. Even Barrett seemed to register it. But then Crockett leaned in, and the room knew something was about to change. The lean forward was small, almost imperceptible, but in a chamber tuned to the frequency of power, it landed like a drumbeat. Jasmine Crockett drew in a breath, not rushed, not defensive, measured. The cameras caught it. The audience felt it. Every reporter in the room raised their pens instinctively, as though their instincts knew a moment was about to etch itself into history. When she spoke, her tone was not raised. That was the first shock. No shouting, no theatrics. Just clarity. A voice that carried with the ease of someone used to being ignored but unwilling to stay invisible. She began by repeating Barrett's own words back to her, slowly, deliberately, as if holding them up to the light so everyone could see the cracks. The gallery stirred. Barrett shifted in her chair, the faintest tightening of her jaw betraying what her calm mask tried to conceal. Crockett paused. The silence was thunderous. Cameras clicked in rapid-fire bursts, the staccato rhythm of anticipation. When she resumed, her words sliced cleaner than any gavel, facts, grounded in law, history, and lived experience. She drew a straight line between Barrett's remark and a broader legacy of exclusion, reminding the room that dismissiveness wasn't just rude, it was systemic, it was generational, and it was dangerous. Every sentence landed with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed nothing but lived everything. She did not hedge, she did not retreat into abstractions. Instead, she pointed to real communities, real consequences, weaving narratives of families left behind, rights stripped away, voices silenced. Each example was a brick, stacked carefully, building a case too strong to ignore. Barrett, who had relied on her robe as armor, suddenly looked smaller behind the bench, her authority shrinking with each passing word. The murmurs grew louder now, no longer whispers but audible gasps. Even those who had walked into the chamber neutral were being swept into Crockett's rhythm. She wasn't just dismantling Barrett's remark, she was exposing the arrogance behind it, the hollowness of its foundation. The contrast could not have been sharper. Crockett's calm dignity radiated, while Barrett's composure cracked under the heat of being confronted by someone who refused to be diminished. Another pause. Crockett let the silence work for her, eyes steady, hands folded, the picture of composure. She looked directly at Barrett, not with anger, but with the piercing steadiness of someone who had finally been given the microphone and refused to let go. The tension became unbearable. The audience leaned forward. Barrett looked down briefly at her papers, a flicker of retreat caught by the cameras. And then came the pivot, the moment where Crockett turned the confrontation from personal defense to universal truth. She reminded the room that America was not defined by who sat in robes or behind benches, but by the people whose voices had been kept outside those walls for far too long. Her words were not only for Barrett, they were for every young woman watching at home, every immigrant family gathered around a kitchen table, every community scrolling through their phones searching for proof that dignity could stand toe-to-toe with power and win. Barrett attempted an interjection, a subtle attempt to reclaim control. But Crockett didn't flinch. She allowed the interruption to hang for half a breath, then calmly overrode it, not louder, but firmer, her voice threading over Barrett's like steel over silk. The gallery erupted in a low, stunned murmur. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The climax came not as a scream, not as an angry rebuke, but as a line so sharp, so undeniable, that it detonated the silence. Crockett, her tone steady, declared, "You may sit in judgment, but you will never silence the truth I carry, not mine, not my people's, not this country's." The chamber gasped. Reporters froze mid-sentence. The words echoed, replaying in the collective memory of everyone present. It was the kind of line that doesn't just end an exchange, it defines it. The kind of line that, within seconds, would be clipped, captioned, and sent hurtling across social media. Barrett's face revealed what her words could not. The mask cracked. Her smirk faltered. For the first time, she looked rattled, exposed. Crockett, meanwhile, sat back, composed, the weight of her counterstrike radiating like a wave rolling through the chamber. And just like that, the courtroom was no longer Barrett's domain. It belonged to Crockett. The audience murmurs turned to applause outside the official record, as if restraint itself could no longer contain the energy. Cameras flashed in blinding bursts, desperate to capture Barrett's unease, Crockett's unshaken authority. Journalists whispered to each other that they had just witnessed the moment of the year, maybe the decade, a clash destined not to remain inside marble walls but to explode across every feed, every headline, every conversation. Because Crockett hadn't just answered Barrett. She had obliterated the idea that power meant unquestionable authority. She had reminded the room that real power flows upward, from the people whose stories cannot be dismissed. The words had barely finished echoing in the chamber before they were everywhere. Phones lit up, timelines flooded, and within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown had already gone viral. The caption varied depending on who shared it, but the sentiment was the same: "This is the clapback America needed." On Twitter, hashtags erupted like fireworks, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag truth over power, hashtag unbothered and unbroken. The short video, less than 30 seconds long, spread across feeds at breakneck speed. It wasn't just politics junkies tuning in, it was students, young professionals, everyday citizens who felt the raw electricity of a woman refusing to be diminished. The comment sections turned into waves of affirmation. Finally, someone said it. "This is what courage looks like." I just stood up from my couch and applauded. Memes followed quickly, some playful, some reverent. One froze the exact frame of Crockett leaning in, paired with captions like, the moment she knew she had the room. Others turned Barrett's shaken expression into a symbol of arrogance crumbling under truth. TikToks layered Crockett's line over music, turning it into an anthem. Teenagers who rarely shared political clips were syncing her words to remixes, chanting them as if they were lyrics. Journalists scrambled to keep up. Major outlets pushed out breaking news banners, framing the exchange as a seismic cultural moment. Pundits on live television replayed the clip in slow motion, dissecting Crockett's composure, Barrett's faltering mask, the exact timing of the pauses. Analysts who often buried emotion under jargon found themselves leaning into words like devastating, iconic, and unforgettable. And then came the late-night hosts. Monologues opened with replayed clips, the audience laughing and cheering as Crockett's words hit the big screen. Comedians mimicked Barrett's dismissiveness before cutting to Crockett's mic drop line, milking the contrast for all its comedic and cathartic power. That, one host declared, is how you school a judge without even raising your voice. The crowd roared. But it wasn't just entertainment. Politicians, celebrities, and activists weighed in, amplifying the ripple. A pop star tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just became my hero." A civil rights leader wrote, "This is more than a moment. It's a reminder that dignity still speaks louder than arrogance." Even international voices chimed in, framing the exchange as proof that America's generational shift was alive and visible. In community centers, on college campuses, in barbershops and coffee shops, people replayed the clip like a shared secret they couldn't stop talking about. For some, it was validation, the kind they rarely saw in political spaces. For others, it was inspiration, proof that someone who looked like them, who spoke with their cadence, could not only survive in a room built to silence them but dominate it. The impact rippled back into Washington too. Reporters noted that Barrett, long the picture of unshakable authority, had been rattled in a way that would now follow her reputation. Crockett, meanwhile, was elevated overnight from a rising voice to a defining one. Her inbox flooded with invitations, interviews, panels, rallies. She had crossed the line from representative to symbol. Public perception shifted almost immediately. Barrett's words were replayed not as authority but as arrogance, the latest entry in a long pattern of dismissive elitism. Crockett's response was celebrated as courage, a refusal to bow to condescension. And in that contrast, millions saw a story bigger than the two women themselves. They saw the clash of old power and new, of gatekeeping and breakthrough, of arrogance and dignity. The clip wasn't just viral, it was sticky. It lived in group chats, stitched into reaction videos, quoted in classrooms. It resonated because it wasn't polished, because it wasn't planned, it was raw, human, undeniable. Crockett had spoken not as a politician seeking applause, but as a woman defending her right to be there, and in doing so, defending the right of everyone watching who had ever been told to stay quiet. But what truly mattered wasn't just the viral moment, it was the lesson Crockett delivered. In the days that followed, as the clip continued to ripple through every corner of the internet, Jasmine Crockett did what true leaders always do, she took the personal and turned it into something universal. Standing before cameras, speaking to crowds, or even in quiet reflections posted online, she made clear that this wasn't just about a sparring match between two women in power. It was about what their exchange represented. Crockett reminded the public that dignity always outlasts arrogance. Arrogance may win the room for a moment, but dignity reshapes the narrative for generations. She reframed Barrett's cutting remark not as a personal insult but as a mirror of the broader struggle, how elitism has long tried to dictate who belongs and who does not. By refusing to bow, Crockett turned condescension into a stage for truth. She spoke of service, not as a title, not as a robe, not as an office, but as a commitment. True service, she insisted, comes from showing up for the people who cannot afford to sit in gilded chambers or command lofty authority. Service outshines elitism because service is rooted in humanity, while elitism is rooted in ego. And in that contrast, the crowd found its anthem. Her words struck a deeper chord because they weren't abstract. They carried the rawness of lived struggle, the kind families feel when they're denied justice, when their votes are diluted, when their voices are dismissed. Crockett was not speaking as one woman answering another, she was speaking as a representative of millions, saying out loud what so many had been waiting to hear, that they deserved to be seen, to be respected, to be heard. The crescendo came when she declared, "This wasn't just a debate, it was a reminder that voices once dismissed can now define the future." The line wasn't scripted, but it was unforgettable. It echoed in rallies, appeared on protest signs, and became the tagline of countless social media posts. More than a defense, it was a declaration. A declaration that America's story was not finished, that the chapters ahead would be written by those who refused to be silenced. And with that, she tied the moment back to the ideals that had always made America's greatest transformations possible: justice, equality, resilience. Justice, because no one deserves to be treated as lesser for speaking truth. Equality, because the power to define the future must be shared by all. Resilience, because change does not come easy, it comes through standing tall in the face of those who would rather you stay small. The audience watching, whether in person, online, or through the retelling of the story, felt the transformation. What began as an exchange of remarks had grown into a parable, a reminder of why ordinary people invest their hopes in extraordinary voices. Crockett had turned a chamber into a stage, a remark into a movement, and a viral moment into a living lesson. And so, we circle back to that defining flashpoint, the moment Judge Amy Coney Barrett tried to diminish Jasmine Crockett with a dismissive remark, only to find herself eclipsed by a response so sharp, so dignified, it shifted the entire room. What began as arrogance ended as revelation, and the viral moment was more than just a headline, it was history catching up to power. Crockett's mic drop wasn't just words. It was a reminder that courage still has a place in politics, that truth can still cut through posturing, and that the voices once treated as background noise are now center stage. Her poise, her fire, and her refusal to yield became a beacon for millions who saw themselves in her. This is what moral clarity looks like, not arrogance cloaked in authority, but dignity spoken with conviction. In that single exchange, Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended the principle that every American voice matters, no matter how much the powerful might try to silence it. That's the kind of heroism we can't afford to overlook. And here's where you come in. If you believe in voices like Jasmine Crockett's, voices that challenge arrogance, speak truth to power, and remind us of who we are, then hit subscribe. Because every subscription, every click, every share is a way of saying, we won't let arrogance have the last word.